The Asus ProArt StudioBook 17 versus the MacBook Pro 16. Which laptop is going to take the crown for the best big screen powerful laptop for creative professionals? I'm going to run these laptops through video editing and design tests to see which one can beat out the other.
Let's get rocking.
If you're new to the channel, my name is Benji Kaiser. This is where you're going to find the best tech and tools for creative professionals. So if that sounds like your kind of place, consider subscribing and ring the bell so you don't miss out on any of the future videos. Also, if you're curious about the exact prices or specs of either of these models in depth as we're heading through this video, you can head down into the description below and click one of those links. Now, if you do use that link, I will get a small commission, but at no extra cost to you, and that's what keeps this channel alive and the helpful content coming your way. If you want to get a discount on the StudioBook 17, you can head on over to Computer Upgrade Kings and use the discount code BEN3, where you can get a discount code on that laptop or any other laptop over on their website. Starting out with the build quality, as always, both laptops come with an all-aluminum chassis, the StudioBook with its steel blue brushed silver body, and the MacBook Pro toting its classic smooth silver or deep gray, depending on the model of your interest. I must say I really like the aesthetics of the StudioBook over the MacBook Pro. It is so regal compared to the drab MacBook Pro. The steel blue and gold combination is just spot on. I will say that although both laptops are all aluminum, the MacBook Pro has a slightly more sturdy build in regards to the material used. It seems a little thicker and that it will be slightly more durable over time. The MacBook Pro is also roughly a pound lighter and a few points thinner, weighing in at 4.3 pounds and a thickness of 0.64 inches, whereas the StudioBook 17 is 5.4 pounds and has a 0.72 inches of thickness. The StudioBook 17 definitely wins concerning the port selection. Without the need for a dongle, it comes with 3 USB-A 3.1 Gen 2, USB-C 3.1 DisplayPort, HDMI 2.0. It comes with an SD card slot as well as a mic and headphone jack combo, whereas the MacBook Pro simply comes with 4 Thunderbolt ports and a headphone jack. Upon opening the lid, I'm required to use 2 hands for the snug StudioBook hinge, whereas the MacBook Pro is able to easily open with 1 hand. Concerning the hinges, I like the MacBook Pro setup better as it is one large singular hinge spanning the entire bottom of the screen versus the 2 separate outer hinges on the StudioBook. The hinges on the StudioBook are still great, but just not as sturdy as the MacBook Pro. The StudioBook comes with a 17-inch 16:10 IPS Full HD matte display. It is rated at 300 nits and has a refresh rate of 60 Hz, and according to my tests, can reach a color gamut range of 100% sRGB, 89% Adobe RGB, and 100% DCI-P3, all at a Delta E 1.39. Whereas the MacBook Pro comes with a 16-inch Retina gloss display. It is rated at 429 nits, has a refresh rate of 60 Hz, and according to my test, can reach a color gamut range of 100% sRGB, 100% Adobe RGB, and 100% DCI-P3, all at a Delta E of 0.6, which is really good. They both come with 720p webcams, and the StudioBook has a webcam shutoff switch so you don't get cyber spied on. Moving on to the keyboard deck, the StudioBook has an aluminum/plastic keyboard deck. Although I prefer the all aluminum, I think the groove plastic accent is suitable for the build. The MacBook Pro is of course all aluminum and comes with a scissor switch keyboard, and honestly it feels just like the old MacBook Pro keyboard, which is probably the biggest compliment you could pay to this laptop. They have given 1mm of travel to the keys to the former 0.56mm given to the butterfly keyboard. But I must say the MacBook Pro has been knocked off its top spot as one of my favorite keyboards by the StudioBook. It is very quiet and has snappy keys that respond very well. And although it is snappy, it still has a soft push under your fingers. So I'd say really great job on this keyboard, Asus. Now, as far as the trackpad is concerned on the StudioBook 17, that is an entirely different story. Now, I will say that the glass trackpad is nice, the precision drivers are great, and the touch gestures are on point. But things take a turn for the worse when you conduct a full click on the trackpad. It is clunky, loud, and sounds a little loose or unstable. The MacBook Pro still holds the top spot for best trackpad to ever exist, in my opinion. It is the ultimate creative professional trackpad with amazing touch gestures, click sensitivity, and the like. Now, which laptop will last longer on the go? I must say Asus did not do themselves any favors when they decided to include a 57 watt-hour battery. This laptop can only expect roughly 4 to 5 hours of web browsing battery life and roughly 2 hours of heavy design or editing work on the go. So if I were you, I would keep the charger with me when I'm out of the office. Whereas the MacBook Pro comes with a 100 watt-hour battery that is the FAA approved for flight. So that's the biggest battery you can take on an airline. Apple is claiming 11 hours of battery life, but those battery tests are run at about 50% screen brightness while web browsing. So according to my tests for graphic designers and video editors, you are looking at anywhere from 6 to 8 hours of battery life, and then maybe a little bit less if you're doing really heavy design or video editing work. Okay, now on to the fun part, the performance tests. The MacBook Pro I tested was the i7 base model. It came with the Intel 9th Gen Core i7 9750H, 16 gigs of RAM, the AMD Radeon Pro 5300M with 4 gigs of GDDR6 VRAM, and a solid-state hard drive of 512 gigs, whereas the Asus ProArt StudioBook 17 was not so base. It did come with the Intel 9th Gen i7 9750H with 6 cores and 12 threads, but it steps up the GPU with the NVIDIA Quadro RTX 3000 Max-Q with 6 gigs of GDDR6 VRAM. Comes with 64 gigs of RAM, DDR4 clocked at 2,667 megahertz, and 2 hard drives, one 2 terabyte SATA SSD and one 500 gig SATA SSD. Now, I know that this is a difference concerning the RAM and GPU, but I did not want that to keep me from providing this review for you. Plus, I want you to consider the test results you are about to see. If after these test results you are considering the StudioBook 17, then I would personally push you towards 32 gigs of RAM. I personally think 64 gigs is a little overkill for this setup. Starting things out with Photoshop, which is the program I use to see how well this laptops will handle performance for photographers, illustrators, and graphic designers, as it is the most intensive program in the Adobe CC design suite. The StudioBook handles Photoshop well, but the MacBook Pro comes in at a whole 100 points higher than the StudioBook. That is why you can't always judge a laptop by its component spec sheet. You have to find out how those components are optimized in the specific laptop for the performance you are looking for. And though the StudioBook 17 has 64 gigs of RAM and a 6 gig GPU, the RTX Quadro 3000, you are seeing better tests out of the MacBook Pro. Moving on to the video editing benchmarks, I'm going to open up a 4K project with some B-roll and variety of motion graphics and run it in the timeline to see how well it can handle playback. Both the MacBook Pro and the StudioBook 17 are able to run smooth playback in the timeline at full quality without any drop frames. For the exporting test, I'm going to take a 9-minute 4K clip, place it into Premiere Pro, and export it out at 4K and 1080p YouTube settings. The StudioBook 17 can do the 4K export in 6 minutes and 54 seconds, whereas the MacBook Pro can do the 4K export in 5 minutes and 41 seconds. And the StudioBook 17 can do the 4K to 1080p export in 2 minutes and 26 seconds, and the MacBook Pro can do the 4K to 1080p export in 1 minute and 39 seconds. Now, how loud were these laptops during export? While conducting the 4K export, the MacBook Pro ramped up to an average of 56 decibels, whereas the StudioBook 17 did not climb higher than 44 decibels. Considering this, that means that the StudioBook 17 introduced some CPU throttling to reduce the stress on the CPU and give us a quieter but slightly longer export time. But honestly, 10 decibels less of noise was rather pleasant comparatively, and only cutting off around a minute of export time, it's a pretty worthy comparison. By the way, I have run 14 other tests on the StudioBook 17, so if you are curious about how this laptop handles After Effects, 3D modeling, and more, you can check out that video in the YouTube cards above. If you're looking for an on-the-go laptop that is thin and light and provides you hours of on-the-go battery life, has an excellent performance in Premiere Pro and Photoshop with wonderful color accuracy, and totes the Mac OS, then I would choose the MacBook Pro 16. But if you're looking for a laptop that has a massive color accurate screen, is thin and light for its size, exports quickly and quietly out of Premiere Pro, has one of the most unique and regal build aesthetics, runs cool during a mass number of benchmark tests, then I would pick the Asus ProArt StudioBook 17. Again, if you're curious about the exact pricing of either of these models, you can head down in the description below and click one of those links. And if you do use that link, I will get a small commission, but at no extra cost to you. Keep editing, keep designing, keep creating. I'm Benji Kaiser, and I'll see you here on the next video.